Hi everyone. Today we are going to be looking at the Unit 5 terms. Those terms are on the first two pages of your reader for Unit 5. So you should have those open, or that open, excuse me, and be ready to fill it in as we go along. So let's get started. We're going to start with this quote from Patrick Henry, which is at the bottom of your screen right now. "Give me liberty or give me death." It's a pretty famous quote that I'm sure you've heard Patrick Henry fighting in the Revolution. But what is this concept of what liberty is? The unit is based on securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Well, what does that mean? What is liberty? Are liberty and freedom the same thing? That's what we're going to look into today. All right? So here are our terms. They're the same ones that you have in your notebook, or in your reader, excuse me, so you don't need to write any of these down, but this is what we're going to be talking about today. So you see the first few terms are liberty, freedom, positive, and negative liberty. Yes, there are different things. Then we get into some legislation, the Emancipation Proclamation, and a few amendments from the Civil War, and then some notable people. And the two main topics that we're going to be discussing in this unit are African American fight for freedom post-slavery, and in fact, towards the end of slavery, and then women's suffrage as well. So those are the two main topics for Unit 5, and we'll get into what other topics we might be looking at in this unit as well. Okay, so let's keep going. So liberty or freedom, which one of these do you think that you most understand at this point? You have liberty and freedom, which are two different terms. Liberty means to be unconstrained from the arbitrary or despotic government or control. The latitude of action one has in civil society, which basically boils down to the quote that I have at the bottom there, which is that we should be allowed to do whatever we want so long as we don't hurt other people. Right? That's basically what liberty in a nutshell means. We should be allowed to do whatever we want as long as we don't hurt other people, right? Anything within that limit is pretty much liberty. That's when we use that term, that's what we're discussing. Freedom, on the other hand, it's a very, very similar concept, but they're not quite interchangeable for our purposes. With freedom, you have absolute limitless decision-making authority. Nobody's going to tell you what you can't do, and you don't have any ties or obligations to other people or other ideas. You are literally free to do what you want at any old time, which is a quote by the Rolling Stones from one of their earlier songs from the 60s. So liberty and freedom are very similar concepts, but ultimately they are different. They're not the same thing. Okay, so with liberty, you're still kind of tied to this idea of a community, of a country. In freedom, you have the opportunity to do whatever you would like to do. Now, let's talk about slavery, because that is something that we need to confront as a real issue. And I know that we've talked about slavery. You've probably learned about slavery in 8th grade and previous years as well, but it is important to confront this. The definition that we're going to use is that slavery is a condition in which one human being was owned by another. A slave was considered by law as property or chattel and was deprived of most of the rights ordinarily held by free persons. That's from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So, enslaved people had neither liberty nor freedom. Again, I know you've probably heard a lot about slavery up to this point, and the picture on the right side of your screen is graphic. But it is a necessity that we actually understand what slavery was. People owned other people and viewed them as property, viewed them the same as owning land or owning a building or owning livestock. That is what the system of slavery was, and it still has lasting impacts to this day. Okay, so just because slavery was gone does not mean that the effects of slavery are not still around and don't still impact the United States at all. I think we can all understand that it is still very much present, even though the practice has effectively been gone for 150 years. Now, we do have positive and negative liberty. Those are slightly different than liberty or freedom. So when we're talking about liberty, there are two types of liberty that we're going to discuss. Positive liberty are things that the government must do for us. So positive liberty is the possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. Positive liberty is also sometimes attributed to collectivities or to individuals considered primarily as members of given collectives. So being able to say, I am my own master, being able to have that self-determination and self-fulfillment that allows you to do what you would like to do. An example might be prohibition, the 18th Amendment. So even though prohibition was taking alcohol away from the people in the United States, you can still view that as positive liberty because the people made the choice to take that right away from themselves in order to become the best versions of themselves as they could. So in order to become fully realized people, the citizens of the United States and the lawmakers of the United States took alcohol away. So I know that seems potentially strange because we're talking about positive liberty and you're taking something away, but positive liberty enables you to become the best version of yourself, to become fully realized, fully actualized as a human. On the other hand, we have negative liberty, which are things that the government cannot do to us. This one you're probably a little bit more familiar with. Negative liberties include the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. You have negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. So it's usually attributed to individual agents. A good example would be the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment to the Constitution. The government shall make no law establishing or regarding an establishment of religion. That would be a good example of negative liberty, right? Things that the government cannot do to us, established legally in the Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. It wasn't a law, it was an executive order, and we've talked about what the difference between those two things is, based on the powers that Lincoln had during the Civil War. There were certain things that don't often get discussed with Lincoln, and what his powers were and what he did with his powers during the Civil War. But basically, the Emancipation granted freedom to the slaves in the 11 states rebelling against the United States. Now, the issue with that is that those 11 states did not consider themselves at the time part of the United States. So why would they listen to this executive order when they didn't consider themselves part of the country anymore? That always brings up the question, well, did it really emancipate anyone? That's potentially up for you to decide, but we can also look to history to see what changes there were after the Emancipation Proclamation was released. People in Mississippi were not necessarily saying, oh, President Lincoln in the United States is telling us that all the slaves are free now, so we have to listen to him. That's not how it happened. So yes, it was a very important document, and it did set in motion some of the things that were to come post-Civil War. But the question always arises, did the Emancipation Proclamation actually emancipate anyone? Getting to the first of our Reconstruction amendments here, we have the 13th Amendment. We're going to have some practice with Roman numerals at this time. So X means 10, I means 3, right? So one I I equals 1. So the 13th Amendment of the Constitution is the first of those Reconstruction era amendments. This is the actual abolition of slavery in the United States. It ended chattel slavery, like we talked about before, as it was practiced in the South, as well as involuntary servitude, which is slightly different than slavery, not completely different, but slightly different than slavery. This amendment was ratified in December of 1865 by the necessary number of states. So not only do both houses of Congress, both chambers of Congress need to approve any amendments, but the states themselves need to vote on the ratification. And that happened in December of 1865. Interestingly, you only need a certain number of states to approve amendments. You don't need every state to approve the amendments. So we have some fairly recent ratifications of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Kentucky finally ratified the 13th Amendment in 1976, which, if you're keeping track at home, is 111 years after it was ratified by all the states, or by the necessary number of states. And Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment a good 130 years after the official ratification by the necessary number of states. The 14th Amendment, XIV. X is 10, I is 1, V is 5 if there's a 1, or if there's an I before a number, or before another numeral, it means 1 less than that. So this is the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and all equal protection under the law to all citizens. The procedures that government must follow before it deprives an individual of life, liberty, or property. There are certain things that if you are arrested, if you're accused of something, there are certain necessary steps that you need to go through. And this was not necessarily the case for all people in the United States, especially enslaved people who were not considered citizenship. This also grants anyone born in the United States citizenship. So another really, really important amendment, and that was ratified after the Civil War in December of 1866, so 1 year after the 13th Amendment. This was much more hotly contested than the 13th Amendment was. And the third amendment that we're going to be talking about right now, we'll get to another one a little bit later, is the 15th Amendment, XV 15, 10, and 5. So this gave voting rights not to everyone. Keep in mind how I'm phrasing that at the top of the screen there. Gives voting rights to males over 21 regardless of race. Unfortunately, it did not grant females the right to vote. Just males over 21 regardless of race. Also gave Congress the power to enact legislation to enforce the right against race-based denials of the vote. So technically, in the language of the 15th Amendment, if there's any attempt to prevent people from exercising this amendment, Congress can step in. However, after a while, after about 20-ish years of really rigorous enforcement of this amendment, this was pretty much ignored for about 100 years, a century, particularly in the South starting in the late 1880s, early 1890s, things like Jim Crow laws, which I hope you're familiar with, poll taxes, where you had to pay in order to be able to vote, but only certain people had to pay in order to vote, and things like lynching. Those are all a result of the lack of enforcement of the 15th Amendment. This was finally ratified in February of 1870. So there was about 20 years or so where this amendment was enforced, and you saw much larger numbers of African American congresspeople, or congressmen specifically, in the South. And then when this started to not be enforced as much, you saw a lot of migration from the South to other parts of the United States from the African American community. Now we're going to talk about some people involved in the fight for freedom for African Americans, first of which is probably the most important Black American of the 19th century. His name is Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure you've heard of before. Frederick Douglass was a former an escaped slave, and he was a fantastic speaker, a really great speaker and writer against slavery and racism. We're going to talk about him a bunch, and we're going to read a speech that he gave on the 4th of July that is, for my money, one of the best speeches and most powerful speeches I've ever read. Another guy who's very, very important in the 20th century is named Thurgood Marshall. He was the chief counsel of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He drafted the constitutions for the emerging nations of Ghana and Tanzania after they won their independence in the mid-1900s. He was the attorney in the Brown versus the Board of Education case in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. And he was also the GOAT U.S. Solicitor General, greatest of all time, if you don't know what that acronym means. The Solicitor General is one of the most important positions you can hold in the Department of Justice in the United States, and basically argues the case for the United States in the Supreme Court. He had a great track record of 14-5 winning cases for the United States in the Supreme Court. So yeah, he is, in my opinion, the GOAT Solicitor General in the United States. He was also the first African American Supreme Court justice appointed in the late 1960s. There's another man who you no doubt have heard of. His name is Martin Luther King Jr., and the speech that I'm sure you're aware of, the I Have a Dream speech, which was a landmark address delivered by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it really talked about the vision for full racial equality in American society. Delivered it at the March on Washington in 1964. And some more background on him, which I'm sure you're aware of. He was a civil rights activist, believed in nonviolent protest. He was also a Baptist minister, led the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycotts, and one of his probably most important pieces of work is the letter from Birmingham jail. If you haven't read that, I strongly suggest reading it at some point soon. We're not going to cover that in our class, but it's more powerful, in my opinion, than the I Have a Dream speech because of the sheer depth of knowledge that he possessed writing from a jail cell after he was arrested for protesting. So please check out the letter from Birmingham jail if you have the time. He was also the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. When he was assassinated in 1968, he was only 39 years old, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. So you can do the math on that. We're also going to be discussing women's suffrage in this unit. Women's suffrage is the struggle for women to vote and be able to stand for elected office. That amendment that you see, XIX, X is 10, and 1 before, that is the 19th Amendment, right? So XIX, 1 before the 20th. The 19th Amendment prohibits discrimination of voting rights based on sex. We're going to be spending a bunch of time talking about women's suffrage and the women's suffrage movement, as well as the woman on this next slide, who is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the forerunners of the women's suffrage movement in the 1800s. There was a women's rights convention called the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a number of other women who were there wrote a document called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And we're going to be doing a close reading of this in comparison to another very famous declaration and trying to pull out what some of the most important parts of that Declaration of Sentiments were in 1848. So this guy that you see on the left side of your screen is Howard Zinn. He wrote a book that I have in my room. It's called A People's History of the United States. He was a professor, a historian, an author. He was a World War II veteran, and he was also a very progressive thought leader. He is known for his beliefs in deconstructionism, which is a different branch of historiography. Um, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are different ways that people think about history. It's not all just this is what happened, this is what happened. Um, Part of what we've been looking at this year is perspectives, right? So Howard Zinn believed in deconstructionism. So it was this movement in the 60s that kind of questions everything that we think we know at the point that we're discussing. So the first thing that you need to do in order to try to get in this way of thinking is to be okay with the fact that you might not ever really know what happened. That there isn't one thing that necessarily happened. People have different perspectives, right? That's number two. You need to seek to understand multiple perspectives, multiple viewpoints of the same issue or of the same event. And number three, the third thing that deconstructionists try to do is to question the traditional or predominant narrative of history as self-serving for the privileged in a society. There has been a blowback on textbook publishers in the last few decades because pretty much all that was in textbooks was white male history and no other perspectives other than from white men. So trying to incorporate the voices of the people and all different types of people with all different walks of life, which is why if we go back to his book, A People's History of the United States, it is just that. It is primary sources from people who were living through events, from farmers, from the women at the Seneca Falls Convention, from former slaves, from all different sorts of people that traditionally we haven't heard from in society. So Howard Zinn was a mainstay in that type of thinking, in deconstructionist thinking. And that's something that we're going to be discussing this marking period as well. So I hope that this was informative. You can pause and rewind and go back if I spoke too quickly. If you have any questions, please feel free to come and ask me. I'm more than happy to go through some of this with you. Okay? Have a wonderful day, everybody.